On the afternoon of Wednesday, November 17, 2010, a 54-year-old woman named Diane Zaleski pulled her car into her driveway in Union Township, New Jersey, which is a small suburb of New York City. Diane was just about to get out of her car and go inside when her cell phone inside of her purse began to ring. She opened it up and she looked at her phone, and the caller ID said it was her sister-in-law, Debbie. So Diane picked it up and she said hello, and immediately Debbie asked her for a favor. She said that she needed someone to drive her to a doctor's appointment the next day, and she was wondering if Diane could do that. And Diane did not have to consult her calendar to know that her schedule tomorrow was wide open. Just a few months ago, she'd retired from her 17-year career as a legal secretary and then had moved to this particular neighborhood to be closer to her aging parents and her brother. And so her only job at the moment was helping out her family, which didn't take up all her time, and tomorrow she was free. So Diane told Debbie, that she'd see her tomorrow, and then the pair hung up. After that, Diane gathered up her things and got out of her car, and then as she was about to walk inside of her home, she stopped and just turned around and looked out at her new neighborhood. And it was really nice here. The block was full of all these beautiful homes and well-kept lawns. This was just a really nice place to live. And so as she was just, staring out at the scene, she saw the woman who lived across the street, her name was Wife. She'd gone out with plenty of men over the years, and she still got hit on pretty aggressively at bars, and she'd even been proposed to once. But despite, meeting lots of men and liking quite a few of them, she just had never gotten married. Message him this very flirty message when she heard her doorbell downstairs ring. And when she heard this, she was sort of surprised because she definitely was not expecting anybody. But, she still obviously got out of bed and got herself together and headed downstairs to see who it was. And when she unlocked and opened the door, the person standing outside in the cold was somebody that she immediately recognized. Now, she really had no idea what they were doing here right now, but she told them to, come inside and then ask them, what's going on. And then this visitor started talking, and they would say something that Diane never expected. The following day, around noon, Diane's 91-year-old father, Stanley Zaleski, was at home watching TV when his phone rang. He picked it up and he heard the voice of his daughter-in-law, Debbie. And Debbie sounded really worried. And she quickly explained to him that Diane had agreed to drive her to a doctor's appointment that morning, but she hadn't shown up. And now, she was reaching out to Diane, but she wasn't answering, and she also wasn't responding to texts. And Stanley, much like Debbie, was very surprised by this, because this was not like Diane at all. So he told Debbie that he would go over to Diane's place right now and check on her, since after all, he lived a lot closer to Diane than Debbie did. Then they hung up, and Stanley yelled for his wife to come on with him. 20 minutes later, Stanley and his wife, Diane's mom, walked up to the front door of Diane's house. As soon as they got there, Stanley began pounding on the door, yelling for his daughter, but there was no answer. And so eventually, after looking at his wife, and they both are like, what's going on here? He reached down and he tried the door handle to see if the door was unlocked, and he found that it was. So he turned the handle and he just pushed the door open, and immediately his eyes were drawn to the ground inside the house, like right in the foyer, because it was all red. There was blood everywhere. A wave of nausea came over Stanley, and he had to grab the door frame to steady himself. But then after a moment, he turned to his wife, who was right next to him, and he just said, "Stay right here. I'm going to go in and look around." And then he stepped inside, and as he moved further into the foyer, which again, there's just like blood splattered everywhere, he began to notice there were piles of strange white dust that he didn't recognize, sort of amongst the blood. There's no sign of Diane, like it's silent in the house. But as Stanley's standing there, he sees that there's also what appears to be a pretty clear trail, like something had been dragged through the blood and was sort of pulled towards the back of the house. And so Stanley, with his heart racing, he began walking, like following this trail of whatever got dragged through the house, and it made its way to the top of the stairs that led down into the basement. And then when Stanley looked down into the basement, he saw something at the foot of the stairs, like a heap of something that was down there. And after a minute, once his eyes adjusted to the dark down there, he saw it was his daughter. And at that point, he sort of staggered back and he yelled out for his wife to call 911. Half an hour later, around 1 p.m, Detective Robert Henderson of the Union County Homicide Task Force drove his police cruiser into a very nice, quiet neighborhood. His partner, Detective Mike Minacchio, was sitting in the passenger seat. And at some point, Henderson, he pulled up to the snow-covered curb in front of a large house that was in the process of being roped off with crime scene tape. Henderson immediately noticed there was an elderly man and woman being interviewed by officers in the front yard of this house. And as soon as Detective Henderson and his partner got out of their cruiser, one of the officers who was out and about ran over to brief them on what the police knew so far. He explained that the elderly man and woman were the parents of the victim, Diane Zaleski. Diane lived alone, this was her home, and her parents had come over earlier and found her foyer covered in blood, and Diane was found lying dead at the bottom of the stairs in the basement. Henderson asked if there were any signs of a break-in or a robbery, and the officer said no, but he warned them that the scene inside the house was really unusual. It seemed like the killer, after killing Diane, had sort of been all over the house, clearly taking a lot of time to both clean up and also contaminate the scene to make it harder for investigators. And when Henderson heard this, he sort of raised an eyebrow, because in his experience, most killers tried to get away from the crime scene as quickly as possible. They wouldn't just linger like that. And so at this point, Henderson turned to Minacchio and was like, how do you want to split this up here? And Minacchio said he would stay and interview Diane's parents. That way Henderson could go inside and inspect the rest of the crime scene. When you're refreshing your space, choosing a paint color can feel weirdly high stakes. Will that seafoam green that you loved online look more like split pea soup on your walls? Luckily, Sherwin-Williams takes the guesswork out of finding the perfect paint color. With 3 easy ways to sample, you can choose color with confidence, testing shades in your actual space before making the final call. Order color chips, peel and stick, or color-to-go paint samples at swsamples.com or visit your neighborhood Sherwin-Williams store to get started today. Moments later, Henderson stepped through the front door of Diane's house, and he saw the huge amount of blood in the foyer. There was so much that he assumed the murder must have taken place right here in the entryway. There was also a lot of white dust all over the floor that Henderson recognized as fire extinguisher powder. Henderson couldn't see any evidence of a fire, so he guessed that what must have happened here is the killer had sprayed down the area with a fire extinguisher in an effort just to contaminate the scene. Henderson noticed there was a trail of blood that sort of left the entryway and headed towards the back of the house, and so he followed it through the hallway into the kitchen, and in there he saw forensic techs standing around the kitchen sink, which was full of all the soapy water. And as he walked in, Henderson, one of the techs pulled a woman's wallet out of the sink and then set it open on the counter to dry. Henderson walked over to check the ID and saw that it was Diane's wallet. And so this was obviously very weird, but it got even weirder when the forensics tech reached back into the water and then fished out something else, a TV remote. And so at this point, Henderson and the techs realized that what must be going on here is the killer must have been dumping these items in the soapy water to try to clean off fingerprints or DNA. But after seeing all this, it made Henderson really wonder, what state would the body be in when he found it? If the killer's going to these many lengths with just ancillary evidence, what did they do to the body? And so after chatting with the techs for a few minutes about how strange this whole thing was, Henderson turned and continued following that trail of blood on the ground, and it led him to the door that went down to the basement. And so he looked down into the basement, and he saw at the foot of the stairs there was a forensic specialist taking photos of Diane's body, which was, right at the foot of the stairs. When Henderson went down there and actually got a look at Diane's body, he had been bracing for, her body to be in pretty rough shape considering what he had seen upstairs, but he was still taken aback by just how violently Diane clearly had been attacked. Her torso, her neck, and her face were covered in literally more stab wounds than he could even count. And then as Henderson leaned in even closer, he saw there were additional bruises on Diane's face and pretty clear defensive marks on her limbs that told him that there had definitely been a pretty big struggle. Also, some of Diane's clothes had been removed, which made Henderson wonder if Diane had been sexually assaulted. And as awful as that obviously is, if that was the case, the upshot was that there was a good chance the killer's DNA could be recovered from her body. However, at the same time Henderson is thinking this, he began to notice a very harsh chemical smell that was clearly coming from Diane's body. And that's when he spotted a bottle of toilet cleaner that was right nearby, and he realized that the killer must have dragged Diane's body down here and then splashed it with chemicals in yet another attempt to destroy evidence. And so at this point, Henderson was getting pretty worried, because the killer clearly had taken a lot of steps to cover their tracks. And if they had done a thorough enough job and the police couldn't find any usable fingerprints or DNA, they'd be relying primarily on witnesses, which are not necessarily hugely reliable. So Henderson just really hoped that was not going to be the case here. But if it was, he just prayed that someone in the neighborhood had seen something. 10 minutes later, Henderson walked down the icy sidewalk, canvassing the neighborhood with his partner, Detective Manacchio. And as they walked, Manacchio filled Henderson in on the talk that he had just had with Diane's parents. What he'd learned was that Diane had recently moved to this neighborhood and that she also dated a lot, mostly men that she met online. And the fact that she dated a lot of people certainly caught Henderson's attention, because all the evidence that they had found so far in Diane's house suggested that she had been killed by somebody she knew. There were no signs of forced entry, and there was evidence of a long, very deliberate cleanup. So the killer had clearly felt comfortable enough to stick around after the murder and had probably known Diane was single, so they were not going to be interrupted. And so Henderson sort of filed these thoughts away as he and his partner arrived at the next house on the block. Henderson knocked, and a moment later, an elderly woman answered the door. And at that point, Henderson explained about Diane's murder, and then he asked her if she had seen anything suspicious around Diane's place the previous day. Cars parked outside, or strange people coming and going, anything. Now, this woman was immediately startled by the news of a murder in this neighborhood. That definitely was the primary reaction she had. But, she quickly recovered and said that no, she hadn't seen anything. However, she did remember seeing some kids playing in the yard across the street from Diane's, so maybe they had seen something. Moments later, Henderson and Manacchio stood on the front porch of the house that was directly across the street from Diane's, and they were speaking to a woman in her 50s who'd introduced herself as Mrs. Yearwood. When Henderson explained about the murder across the street, Mrs. Yearwood gasped and said that, she hadn't known Diane particularly well. I mean, she was new to the neighborhood, but she had always been so friendly to her and her family, and in fact, Diane had even paid Mrs. Yearwood's son to help with some small chores around her house. At this point, Henderson sort of, shifted the conversation and just got to the point. He told her that he had heard that there had been some kids playing outside this house the previous day. And were the kids home? Because he really wanted to speak to them to see if they had maybe heard or seen anything strange on Diane's property the day before. Mrs. Yearwood immediately nodded and turned around and walked into the back of the house, and then a moment later came back with an 11-year-old boy who looked very nervous. And so Henderson, to disarm him, immediately knelt down and touched him on the shoulder and just said, "Look, we're trying to catch a bad guy." And then Henderson pointed across the street and asked the boy had he seen anything strange at Diane's house the day before. The boy, at this point, looked past Henderson over at Diane's house and then back at Henderson, and he just shook his head and said no. And at this point, Henderson, he felt his stomach sink, because with a deeply contaminated crime scene and apparently no good witnesses, this case was already off to a horrible start. Around noon the following day, December 19th, Detective Henderson sat in his office reading through Diane Zaleski's autopsy report. He'd been anxiously waiting for this file all morning, but unfortunately it did not contain much information that he had not already guessed. Diane's time of death was estimated to be between 10 p.m. and 1 a.m., so 11 to 14 hours before her parents found her body. She had been strangled and beaten and also stabbed more than 40 times. The damage was so severe, the medical examiner couldn't actually say which injury killed her. And also the knife that was used in the attack had never been found. They also couldn't tell if Diane had been sexually assaulted, because the chemicals that had been splashed on her body had destroyed any DNA the killer might have left behind. The forensics team also had not pulled any usable fingerprints from the house, thanks to the killer's cleanup efforts. But they did find something that was even better. There were a few drops of fresh blood at the crime scene that did not match Diane's DNA, and early tests showed that they came from an adult male. Now, it was possible that this blood was from someone other than the killer, But Henderson didn't think so. There had clearly been some sort of a struggle between the killer and Diane, so it seemed likely that Diane had managed to wound the killer and maybe draw blood, and maybe this was it. And so now, the game had changed. Henderson's next task would be to collect DNA samples from all the men closest to Diane and compare them to this fresh blood at the crime scene. Now, the digital forensics team had Diane's laptop, and they were working really hard to try to access her online dating profile to try to figure out who she'd been chatting with, because those were definitely some people they might want to compare DNA with. But while Henderson, thought that was great, he wasn't going to wait. He felt like he needed to move on this right now, and he figured if he wanted some answers about who Diane was potentially dating or seeing, or maybe who some of her exes were, he actually knew where he could go to start. Around 9:30 the next morning, Henderson was sitting in a coffee shop across from Diane's best friend, Joanne Govea. Joanne was clearly still processing the murder, and at the moment, she really seemed more angry than anything else. But she told Henderson that she would help any way she could, and that she did know all about the men who were in Diane's life. But of all her romantic partners, there was really only one who concerned her. His name was Mike Prunell, and according to Joanne, he'd been Diane's landlord years ago. After Diane had moved into his building, he'd started showering her with gifts and bugging her to go out with him, and they had ended up dating for a while, but when Diane ended things, Mike had been furious, and Diane had actually had to move to a new place just to get away from him. Now, this obviously got Henderson's attention, and he made a mental note to find Mike as soon as possible. But there was another name that he wanted to ask Joanne about as well. During the search of Diane's house, detectives at Joanne spoke for a bit longer, and then eventually they wrapped it up, and Henderson thanked Joanne for the help. And then as he was leaving, he decided that, he really needed to speak to both Mark and Mike, but he would start with Mark because he had his business card. Now, as Henderson did this, he was sort of studying Mark for any sort of reaction when he saw Diane's picture. But Mark just sort of glanced at the photo and then back up at Henderson, and he said, "Am I supposed to know who this is?" And this totally caught Henderson off guard. Henderson told him that the woman's name was Diane, and he knew that Mark had met her at a bar not that long ago. But Mark just shook his head and insisted that that had not happened. He said he definitely didn't know Diane, and he also would not have chatted her up anywhere, because she apparently was not the kind of, quote, target he usually went for. And that word, target, sort of hung in the air very uneasily between them for a long time. And then eventually, Henderson just sort of, cleared his throat and asked if Mark would be willing to give a DNA sample. And Mark flat out refused. But this only made Henderson even more determined to get a sample. Now, he couldn't force it without a warrant, but he had another idea. Mark had been drinking from that water bottle that he had given him when he first came in, and he just hoped if Mark left it behind, Henderson could scoop it up and send it off for testing. So he told Mark that he was free to go. But Henderson was disappointed when Mark did not throw the bottle away. Instead, he put the cap back on, pocketed the bottle, and he left. Now, Henderson obviously couldn't prove this, but just from the looks of it, the decision to take the bottle like that, it felt deliberate. And it reminded him of just how careful Diane's killer had been to remove forensic evidence from the crime scene. So he gave Mark a few seconds head start, and then eventually Henderson got up and actually followed Mark out of the station, but kept his distance so that he wouldn't notice he was behind him. And Henderson very carefully trailed Mark all the way down the block, and then at some point when Mark stopped and sort of looked around for a moment, Henderson froze until he realized Mark was just checking street signs. And then, Mark just kept on walking and Henderson kept on trailing until eventually Mark pulled out that bottle and he chucked it onto the ground. And then as soon as Mark had walked down the road, turned the corner, and disappeared, Henderson ran over, put on a rubber glove, picked up that bottle, and went right back to the police station. And then as soon as he got there, he put it inside of an evidence bag, and he sent it off to the crime lab for testing. That evening, around 6 p.m., Henderson was sitting at his desk, staring at his computer screen in total frustration. He was reading the results of a database search for Diane's ex-boyfriend and former landlord, Mike Prunell, and he was running into a problem. Henderson could not find anybody with that name. A moment later, Henderson heard a knock at his door, and he called for whoever it was to come on in. And then when the door opened, he saw his partner, Detective Minacchio, standing there with a middle-aged man. And Minacchio explained that This guy was Diane's brother, Ron Zaleski, and he was here to give whatever information he could about Diane's personal life. And Henderson immediately perked up because he realized that, Ron very likely knew Diane's ex-boyfriends and any current boyfriends. So as they sat down, Henderson asked him if he remembered a man named Mike Purnell. And Ron immediately paused and looked really surprised, and then said, yeah, he knows exactly who Mike is. Because at one point, Mike had actually asked their father for his blessing to marry Diane. According to Ron, none of the family had been in love with that idea, because Mike had seemed like a really shady guy. In fact, he had such a long rap sheet that he didn't even go by his real name. Two days later, on November 22nd, Detective Henderson sat in the interview room across from the man who called himself Mike Purnell. His real name was Lou Hubbard, and at this point, Henderson knew that amongst his rap sheet was a conviction for domestic violence against his ex-wife. Apparently, he had savagely beaten her, and Henderson knew that obviously in this murder case, Diane had been savagely beaten, so there's, a similarity there. Now, Henderson had not told Lou that they knew his real name, and he also hadn't told Lou why he was even here, and Lou hadn't asked. And at the moment, Lou was just sort of leaning back in his chair, sort of like making light of this whole thing, like it was totally hilarious that he was being held inside of a police station. At some point, Henderson asked Lou where he had been on November 17th, and Lou just sort of shrugged and said he couldn't remember anything about that day, like it didn't stand out at all to him. At this point, Henderson pulled out that photo of Diane and he slid it across the table to Lou. And Lou, he just glanced at it and then slid it back across the table and said he had no idea who that was. And to Henderson, this was just completely unbelievable, like literally not believable. Because he knew that Lou had literally proposed to Diane, this woman in the photo. So there was no way he did not recognize her. He had to be lying. At this point, Henderson stood up from the table and he looked at Lou and said, "If you want to keep playing dumb, that's fine." Then he stood up and he walked over to the door, he opened it up, and he yelled out for his partner, Detective Minacchio, to bring him the file on Lou. And then a moment later, Minacchio ran down the hall, he handed over the file, and then Henderson went back to the table. Henderson, calm as could be, opened up the file and then began telling Lou that, "I know your name's not Mike Purnell. It's Lou Hubbard. I know all about you. I know that at one point you were going to propose or did propose to this woman, Diane, the one in the photo, the one you claim not to know. We know all about it. We know about your criminal record, your domestic violence conviction. We know all about it." At this point, Lou's entire demeanor had changed. It was like he knew he'd been caught. And he just nodded and said, yeah, he knows who she is. And he also said that he had seen on TV that she had been murdered, but he swore he didn't do it. Now, Henderson really didn't believe the guy because he's just caught him lying. But he told him, hey, if you really didn't do it, there's an easy way to prove that. Give us a DNA sample, like literally right now. And after a long pause, Lou agreed. Around 8 a.m. the next morning, November 23rd, Detective Henderson was working at his desk when his phone rang. When he looked at the caller ID and he saw the extension, he knew it was the crime lab, and he assumed they must be calling to confirm receipt of Mark Baker and Lou Hubbard's DNA samples they had sent over. But when Henderson answered, the analyst on the line explained they were actually calling with an update from digital forensics. The digital team had finally accessed the browsing history on Diane's laptop, and they'd found some activity from the hours after Diane was killed. It looked like the killer, while hanging around inside of Diane's house after the murder, had viewed some pornographic websites, and then they'd also used Diane's credit cards to try and order a MacBook and an iPhone, and they had set the delivery address for these items for Diane's house. Now, Henderson was sort of taken aback by all of this, but what stood out was, well, if they're ordering these items to the scene of the crime, it means they planned on coming back to the scene of the crime. But there was also more. Apparently, the digital forensics team had finally gotten into Diane's dating profile, so now they could see everyone that she had messaged or gone out with in the past. And there were literally dozens and dozens of names. And so when Henderson heard that, he knew that now, there were all these new suspects, dozens of them. They would have to swab and question every one of those men. And so now the case had just totally exploded. Around noon on December 2nd, 2010, so about 2 weeks after Diane's murder, Detective Henderson sat in his car outside of an office building in Newark, New Jersey, watching the front entrance. He'd been there all morning, waiting for a worker whose name was Kyle Porter. Kyle was one of the men that Diane had been messaging with online before she was killed. Henderson had already spoken to him over the phone, and Kyle had actually confirmed that he had been to Diane's house just a few weeks before the murder. But what really made Henderson suspicious of Kyle was just the fact that he had refused to submit a DNA sample, even after Henderson explained that doing so would help clear him as a suspect. So now, as Henderson finally saw Kyle step out of the building and head for the parking lot, Henderson got out of his car and literally ran over to intercept him. And as he did, Henderson flashed his badge, and Kyle for a second looked like he maybe wanted to run, but instead he just sort of stammered that he was going to be late for his lunch meeting, sort of suggesting like, I can't talk to you right now. But Henderson had not waited around all morning just to leave empty-handed here, so he told Kyle that he could either give a sample right now and be on his way, or they could talk again when Henderson came back with a warrant for Kyle's arrest. And Kyle seemed terrified by that idea, so he sighed and said, okay, I'll give you a sample. 4 days later, on the morning of December 6th, Henderson was out jogging before his shift when his cell phone rang. He saw that it was the crime lab calling, so he stopped what he was doing and he answered the call. A forensic analyst from the lab was on the line, and he explained that he was calling because they just finished with the first batch of Henderson's blood samples. This batch included the samples for Mark Baker, the man who Henderson had to secretly trail just to pick up his water bottle, as well as Diane's ex-boyfriend, Lou Hubbard, aka Mike Prunell, and also Kyle Porter, the man she had met through online dating who, only after being threatened with arrest, offered up his DNA swab. And so Henderson held his breath as this analyst read off the results. And not one of them matched the blood sample from the crime scene. For a moment, Henderson thought there really had to be a mistake here, because all three of those men had been so suspicious and so uncooperative. Now, he'd always known that, the crime scene blood that he had tested their samples against maybe wasn't from the killer. But if that was true, then Henderson was really in trouble, because it meant that after all this, he had nothing. Now, the blood from the crime scene had already been tested against the state's DNA bank, and there had been no matches. And now he's got no matches here with these three suspects, and so Henderson knew he really had no choice but to keep finding and testing more suspects. And in the next few weeks and then months, he went through this process over and over, interviewing and obtaining DNA samples from the men in Diane's dating profile history and her email contacts, basically every man who had anything to do with her. He went out and interviewed and tested. In fact, over the next year, the detectives conducted more than 100 interviews and took over 80 DNA samples. But one by one, they all turned into dead ends. One morning in December of 2011, Detective Henderson was at his desk on the phone following up about a tip about Diane's case. So a month earlier, on the anniversary of Diane's death, the local news had aired a big special on the case. And then since then, the police station had been flooded with people calling in various tips. And so now, Henderson and Minacchio had had their hands full following up on all these tips, but so far they had gone nowhere. And so Henderson thanked the person he was on the phone with, even though he sort of knew that what they were telling him was not going to be useful. Then he hung up and let out a frustrated sigh. He was starting to think that he had been totally wrong at the start of this murder, that Diane's killer was not someone she knew, but maybe a random intruder who would be even harder to catch. Or even worse would be, maybe the blood they had been testing all of these suspects against for the last year, that blood maybe didn't even belong to the killer. But just then, Minacchio burst into the office and he had a big grin on his face. And he said he had just gotten a call from this woman who had a story that Henderson needed to hear. Minacchio at this point just handed Henderson his cell phone, and so Henderson put the phone to his ear, and sure enough, there was a woman on the line. And this woman explained that she had an online friend that she spoke with all the time. Now, they'd never actually met in person, but they were still pretty close, and they told each other practically everything. And a few days ago, this online friend of hers had sent a very disturbing message where they openly admitted that they had killed Diane Zaleski. And when this woman told Henderson the actual name of this online friend of hers, he was so confused. But then it was like all at once, the world came crashing down around him because he realized that over a year ago, on the very first day he'd begun investigating Diane's murder, he had made a huge mistake. Based on forensic evidence from the crime scene and the killer's eventual confession, this is what police believe happened to Diane Zaleski on the night of November 17th, 2010. The killer was very nervous as they knocked on Diane's front door, because even though they had been here before, tonight was going to be different. Diane eventually came to the door, and she opened it up, and she seemed sort of surprised to see the killer there. But, she let them inside and asked them, like, what's going on? What are you doing here? And the killer, they hadn't really figured out how they were going to do this. And at some point, they just sort of blurted out the thing they wanted to tell her, which was to tell Diane that they had really intense feelings about her. But as they were sort of like rambling on about all these things they wanted to do with her and how they really just wanted her, Diane stopped them and told them that what they wanted was totally inappropriate and that now they needed to leave. But the killer, after being rejected, refused to leave. And then the killer began to argue. And as they did, they got angrier and angrier until they reached over and grabbed a pair of scissors on the table by the door, and they began stabbing Diane. But Diane, she immediately fought back way harder than the killer had expected, thrashing and kicking until the killer's grip on the scissors slipped. And at that point, the killer actually felt a flash of pain in their hand, and they looked down to see a bloody cut on their hand. But for the killer, this only made them more mad. The killer began to strangle her until finally she stopped moving. Once Diane was still, the killer took their hands off of her and then just sort of looked around at the incredibly bloody mess they'd made in the front of the house. They'd watched enough TV to know that their DNA and fingerprints were probably all over not just Diane's body. A shower, they watched TV, they cooked and ate a bowl of pasta, and they used Diane's laptop to look at pornography and also do some online shopping with Diane's credit card. And then once the killer's clothes were clean and dry, they put them across the street and went into their mother's house. Because the killer was Arnell Yearwood, Diane's neighbor's son. So the huge mistake that investigators made at the very beginning of this investigation was when they found out that the neighbor across the street, Mrs. Yearwood, that her son apparently did chores for Diane. Well, the mistake they made, in particular Detective Henderson, was when Mrs. Yearwood went into the back of the house and came back with that 11-year-old boy that they spoke to that said he didn't see anything strange across the street the day before, they assumed that boy was Mrs. Yearwood's son, and he was the one who was doing chores for Diane. And basically, they're like looking at this kid who's totally innocent, thinking, okay, clearly this kid who's been across the street in her house is not a person of interest. He did not kill anybody. And so the son of Mrs. Yearwood was just sort of forgotten about. What they didn't realize is that 11-year-old boy was not Mrs. Yearwood's son. It was her grandson. Her actual son was a 26-year-old man, Arnell Yearwood, who was actually inside the house on that day. He was hiding in her house. But they just never clarified. They assumed the kid was her son and just sort of wrote off any chance that her son could be involved. And so Detective Henderson and Minacchio didn't put it together until over a year later when they got that tip from that woman who said her online friend confessed to the murder, and his name was Arnell Yearwood. And so ultimately, Diane let Arnell into her house on the night she was killed because she knew and trusted him. He did chores at her house. But he tried to initiate a sexual relationship with her, she rejected him, and so he killed her. Arnell Yearwood was ultimately arrested on April 7th, 2012, so about a year and a half after killing Diane. He would confess to the murder and was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Late on a winter night in the 1970s, a middle-aged train driver named Takashi Ito, along with his assistant, were sitting in the front seat of a small cargo train that was hurtling along the tracks in Hokkaido, Japan. So this was just a 2-car train. There was a cargo train in back, and then there was the front train that, Takashi and his assistant were in. There were no passengers behind them. So it's just these two. And the area that they were driving through was this very desolate area. And basically outside, if they looked out their windshield, all they would have seen was just basically snow and ice and just pitch black darkness and the train's headlights pointing straight ahead. That would have been all they could see, was whatever, was in the headlights. And as they were driving along, they had shut all the windows to the car that they were in, but it was so cold outside and the wind was whipping and they're driving right into the wind that some of the cold air was coming in one of the windows. And, it's freezing cold out there. It was starting to get really cold inside the cabin. And so, both men are starting to shiver. And so at some point, Takashi turns to his assistant and he just tells him to, hey, go ahead and open up the heating vent on the floor. So there was just this little vent that you could open up that would basically expose the engine to the main cabin, and so some heat would come up from the engine. But it would get really hot really quickly, and so you couldn't do it for very long, but it was getting pretty cold. So the situation called for it. And so Takashi sort of had one eye half focused out the windshield, sort of roughly following along with the direction they were going. And then the rest of his attention was just on his assistant, who was doing this mundane task of crouching down and sliding open this vent here. And at some point, the assistant managed to open up the heating box. And right as he did, something caught Takashi's eye outside of the train. Now remember, it's the middle of the night, it's the dead of winter, there's really nothing out there. And even though, of course, it's Takashi's job to pay attention to what's out in front of them, there's no expectation he's going to see anything on the tracks at all until he gets to the next stop, which was quite a ways away. And so the fact that anything caught his attention was alarming, and he turns and he looks out the windshield and he can't believe what he sees right in the middle of the tracks. Just several dozen yards ahead of the speeding train is a woman. She's just standing in the middle of the tracks looking up at the train and doesn't even appear to be trying to move, but she clearly sees the train barreling down on her. She looks terrified, and Takashi and the assistant, they look at each other, they start trying to get the train to stop, but there's no way. The train's going way too fast, it's way too heavy, and so it's like they throw the brakes on, they're trying to stop, but there's nothing they can do, and this woman, she's just not moving. And then eventually the train smashes into her, and like Takashi and the assistant are like, oh my God, I can't believe it. And the train, it eventually comes to a grinding stop, several hundred yards away. And then finally, when it's actually stopped, it's like Takashi and the assistant, they know what's happened. They've just killed someone. I mean, it's clearly an accident, but like the shock of this was unbelievable. And so finally, Takashi, he looks at the assistant and he's like, we have to go out and see if she's okay. I mean, they both knew there was no chance. Like, there's no chance she's alive after being hit by the train. But out they go, and sort of apprehensively, they began walking in the snow towards the back of the train. Now, neither of them had a lighting source. They didn't have a flashlight or anything like that. And they're going towards the back of the train. So they don't have the advantage of the headlights shining where they need to go. All they have are the taillights of the train, which are now flashing red. And so as they're walking through the snow and the wind is whipping and it's pitch black out there, and of course these two men, they're in shock about what they've just seen. They can't believe, like, what was she doing out here? Like, what happened? They're walking and all they're seeing out in front of them is darkness and the occasional, flash of red light that sort of roughly illuminated the snow out beyond the train, and then back to darkness. And they know somewhere out there behind the train is this woman who almost certainly is dead. So it means that there's like a dead body out there. And so Takashi and the assistant, they start making their way back towards the back of the cargo train, and then they begin walking beyond where the train was, basically along the tracks they had just covered. And sure enough, up ahead, periodically illuminated by these red lights, was this, mound on the tracks. It looked very much like a body. And sure enough, as Takashi got closer, he realized it was the woman. And almost immediately, he could tell, one, she was definitely dead. And in some ways, he kind of hoped maybe, there was some miracle that she'd survived somehow, maybe, but definitely confirmed that she's dead. And the second thing was he could sort of see what happened here. Her foot appeared to be wedged in the tracks. She must have been stuck in the tracks. And even though it looked like she wasn't trying to move, it might have been because she literally couldn't.
And so she was trapped, and we hit her and we killed her. But that wasn't all. I mean, this scene was horrible. I mean, her body was destroyed. But more than that, part of her body was missing. All they saw on the tracks were actually just her legs. It was just her lower half, and she had these lace-up dance shoes that would have been very difficult to take off. You know, the dance shoes sort of gave away that this was the woman. You know, they look like feminine legs, feminine feet. But again, her upper half is just gone. And so Takashi and the assistant, they sort of look around in the general vicinity to see if, you know, her upper half is nearby. And again, all they have is this periodic red flashing light across the snow, and it's dark, it's cold, the wind is whipping. And sure enough, just a little ways off the tracks, they see another sort of heap on the ground, and there's nothing else out here. So this has got to be the woman's upper body. And so they cross over the tracks, they leave behind the lower half, and they see there's like a trail of blood across the snow. And when they get to this second mound, it is this woman's upper body. But I mean, the scene, it would have been horrible for anyone to find this, but it was especially so because as they walked up to this woman's clearly, you know, dead upper half, she was looking right at them. I mean, her arms were outstretched and her eyes were open, and her torso, it's positioned in such a way that she was almost like staring at them. And they walk up to her, and her face, Takashi would say that it was almost like she was looking at him with an accusatory look, like she was mad at him for not having stopped the train. Couldn't you see I was trapped on the train? Like, that's what Takashi's thinking. Like, this dead woman is mad at me. She looks like she's furious with me. And so, you know, it was very hard, but they continued walking towards her to, you know, just really confirm that she's definitely dead. This is not like a second person here, but no, it was clearly just the upper half of this woman, and she was definitely dead. And despite the very unsettling nature of the way her body was positioned, ultimately, Takashi and the assistant, you know, just turned around and began walking back towards the train. Now, this is 1970s Japan. They don't have cell phones. In fact, they didn't even have radios. Like, they didn't have a good way to get in touch with anyone. They clearly knew they needed to tell authorities what happened here, but realistically, the only way to do that was to go to the train, and then one of them would have to basically walk to the nearest civilization and get help that way, while the other person stayed with the train and also with the woman. And so the two of them, they get back to the train, they get inside of that front car, inside of the enclosed warm space, and they shut the doors, and they sort of just look at each other like, okay, you know, this is obviously horrible, but like, what are we gonna do? And Takashi, being the more senior of the two, said, well, look, I'll stay here with the train. You, the assistant, go out and get help. You know, I'll be here when you come back.
When you are refreshing your space, choosing a paint color can feel weirdly high stakes. Will that seafoam green that you loved online look more like split pea soup on your walls? Luckily, Sherwin-Williams takes the guesswork out of finding the perfect paint color. With 3 easy ways to sample, you can choose color with confidence, testing shades in your actual space before making the final call. Order color chips, peel and stick, or color-to-go paint samples at swsamples.com, or visit your neighborhood Sherwin-Williams store to get started today.
And so the assistant, as much as it was sort of daunting to have to walk off into the darkness and the freezing cold, it almost was like a relief to get away from this scene. I mean, this was truly horrific. And so, you know, Takashi watched as the assistant bundled up in his jacket, and he headed out the side of the car door, and then off into the darkness he went. And then Takashi was left alone inside of the train with, you know, this woman's body behind them on the tracks. And so shortly after the assistant had gone, Takashi, you know, he's just sitting inside of this unmoving train car. And remember, they had that heating vent open, and even though the train was not moving, there was still quite a bit of heat that was coming up into the cabin. And so it was actually getting quite toasty inside of this train car. And Takashi is literally just not moving. He's just sitting there waiting, you know, just trying not to let his mind wander to this horrible thing that's happened behind him. And he found himself actually feeling kind of tired. I mean, he had had a really long day. I mean, he'd been up for nearly 24 hours at this point. And so suddenly he was like, man, maybe I ought to just lay down and close my eyes for a minute, because obviously when they come back here, they'll wake me up, like, no problem. And so Takashi did eventually get down on the ground right next to that vent, so he was really getting the maximum amount of heat. And he curled up and he closed his eyes. But pretty much immediately, once Takashi closed his eyes and effectively attempted to sleep, all he could see in his mind was that woman standing on the tracks looking up at him before she was struck by the train. And then he would try to, force himself not to think about that, telling himself it really was an accident. He could not have stopped the train. And also, they rounded a corner before they saw her. It wasn't like they could have seen her if they hadn't been fiddling around with the heating vent beforehand. They wouldn't have seen her. They had to turn that corner, and then they saw her. Like, there was no way to avoid this. This was an accident. But it's like he couldn't get that image of the woman out of his mind. And then if he managed not to think about her on the tracks, his mind would then jump to seeing her upper half positioned on the snow with her eyes still open, looking at him with this, in his mind, this sort of accusatory look on her face. And so he can't sleep, but like he's so exhausted from the day and he's just so worn out, it's so traumatic that eventually after, 10 minutes or so, he did begin to feel himself sort of allowing himself to drift off to sleep. Like he did have these horrible thoughts, but he felt himself getting closer to finally being able to get a little bit of sleep. And right at that point, right as he's teetering on actually sleeping, he hears something outside. Now, remember, it's late at night, the wind is whipping, it's the middle of winter, and so there had been this ongoing ambiance of the howling wind and like nighttime winter sounds outside. There are animals out there. I mean, there's lots of noises going on here. But whatever the sound was, he just couldn't quite place it. It almost sounded like metallic, like something was scraping against something else, like maybe two pieces of metal were grinding together, like shk, shk. But he couldn't quite tell what it was, how far away it was, but it really stood out right away amongst all the other noises he was hearing. And so he's laying there on the ground and he's listening to the sound. He can't quite place how close or far away it is. For all he knows, it could be way off in the distance or it could be right in the cargo train behind him. And so as he hears this sound, which is sort of periodic, he tells himself like, oh, maybe it's my assistant. Maybe he's back with help. Maybe he found someone really. And it's definitely getting closer. And the sound is, again, it's like a chik, chik, chik. It's like a grinding sort of like movement almost, like something's coming towards him. And he can tell now that this grinding sort of like rhythmic sound is getting louder and louder and sort of faster and faster. And then finally, as the sound is so loud that it's practically echoing inside of this room he's in, he hears the door to where he is slide open, and he turns and he looks to see what is coming into the train. And when he sees what it is, he starts to scream. About an hour later, Takashi's assistant, who had managed to go get help, was in the back seat of a police cruiser along with two police officers who were driving in the direction of this train. There was actually a road that kind of cut out into this sort of desolate area that overlooked the train tracks, and sure enough, they pulled into this sort of carve out on the road, and the assistant pointed, and there it was. There was the train sort of off in the distance, sort of walking distance from where the car was. And so the cops, they parked, and all three of them, they get out, and the police officers, they had flashlights, and so it was much easier to navigate the sort of barren terrain here, and they walked away from the car down to the train. Now, remember, obviously there has been a tragedy here. This woman was struck by the train, and of course the police know this by this point, and the assistant knows that's what they're walking up to, the scene of this woman being killed. But there really wasn't anything, sort of darker than that. Like, this was a terrible accident, but it's sort of like we just got to follow protocol now. We got to go down there, we got to figure out what happened and sort of, follow process, if you will. And so the three of them, they know what they're walking into, right? They're going to meet Takashi. He's waiting in the train, and they're going to take it from there. And so they're walking through the darkness, and they're shining their lights, and the assistant is behind the two police officers, and they're walking up to the train. And when they get close enough to the train, the assistant begins yelling out for Takashi to let him know, like, hey, we're here, we're here, like, come on out. But Takashi doesn't call back. He doesn't come out of the train. But again, this is not like hugely alarming. The assistant's like, okay, maybe he fell asleep inside of the train car. And so the 2 police officers and the assistant, they make their way over to the door that leads into the front car of the train, and they slide it open and they step inside. It's a very small space, and Takashi's not in there. And there's no sign of anything bad that's happened. He's just not in here. And so the assistant's like, okay, that's weird. It's sort of odd that he didn't respond to us calling for him. He's not in here, but maybe he's in the cargo train, the second car for some reason. And so they leave the front train car and they go into the cargo train car, and Takashi's not in there either. And so at this point, the cops are looking at the assistant like, what's going on here? Like, where would Takashi be? It's the middle of the night. Like, it's just pure barren wasteland. It's ice and snow everywhere. Why would he leave? And so the assistant's like, maybe he left and he's with the body. Maybe he was just standing with the body or something. And so the 2 police officers and the assistant, they begin walking towards the back of the train and then begin following the tracks towards where, the lower half of this woman is, according to the assistant. And so down the tracks they go, and sure enough, eventually they see up ahead the legs that are sort of still stuck in the tracks. And as they're shining the light and they're calling out for Takashi, there's no answer, and Takashi is nowhere to be found. And so now the assistant's really getting worried. Like, it didn't make any sense. Where could he have gone? The only other place that made any sense was maybe over near the torso. But the assistant knows, like, of all places that at least he would want to be, it would not be near the upper half. I mean, that was so creepy. The way the body was positioned, the way it was staring at them. And he knew Takashi had been really unsettled by it. So why would he go over to that? But he told the cops, like, hey, shine the light sort of over there off the tracks, because the upper half of this woman, that's where she is. Maybe he's over there. And so they shine their lights in the direction of where the upper half was. And there's no Takashi, and there's no upper half. There is no torso. The woman's torso is gone. And where it was, very clearly, is this huge sort of like flattened section of snow with blood everywhere. And it's like this just horrible scene, but there's no upper body. So Takashi's gone, and this woman's body, her upper half anyways, is gone. And so now, like, the assistant and the officers, they really don't know what to make of this. But the first thought, at least from the assistant, was maybe a bear came through and was, basically taking the woman's body to go eat it or something. And maybe Takashi was out here, and maybe he got chased off by the bear, or worse, maybe he got attacked by the bear. And this sort of made sense. Like, oh my God, like, is there a bear nearby? Like, do we need to go in the train just to seek safety here? And so the police officers, they're sort of scanning their lights around, trying to see if maybe Takashi's nearby. And at some point they notice there's actually boot prints that leave where the torso had been. And they sort of took off into the night, sort of away from the train, sort of off into the distance. Now, there didn't appear to be any bear tracks around, but again, they're thinking that's what it could be, but they see these boot prints and they're like, we gotta go check. We gotta see if maybe these prints will lead us to Takashi. And so Takashi and the 2 officers, they begin following these tracks, and as they do, they see the prints, these boot prints, get farther and farther apart, like Takashi was running, like his stride was getting longer and longer, and there's blood everywhere, like this drag mark of blood all over the snow. And they follow these prints all the way past the train, way off into the night, where they finally stop in front of this huge utility pole. And at this point, they're looking around like where's Takashi? Like, where did he go? Like, there's nothing down here. And then at some point, they hear something above them. And so the police officers, with their flashlights, they shine up towards the top of this utility pole, where at the top, there was this fairly large metal platform. And as they shine their lights up, they see Takashi. And he's draped over the edge of this platform, totally lifeless. His arms are dangling down, and he's got this horrible, huge wound across his stomach. He's bled all over. He's clearly deceased. And so they're shining their lights up at him, and like the shock of seeing Takashi is horrible. They back up. They're like, oh my God, is there a bear here? Did the bear somehow get up there with Takashi? Like, what's making that noise up there? And they're shining their lights, and at some point they hear a noise again. And then as their lights are aimed towards Takashi in this platform, this figure sort of emerges above Takashi, like it crawled over Takashi, and it peered down at the 2 cops and the assistant. and it was the woman's torso. It's like her upper half. She sort of looked down at them, blood's all over her, and she's sort of clutching on to Takashi. And then in one move, she sort of thrust herself over his body and began pulling herself down the pole towards the men. And the men, they immediately start yelling and they turn and they start running. And as they're running off, all they can hear behind them is chick, 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 which is the sound of this woman dragging herself through the snow towards them. Now, unfortunately, the assistant did not make it. The woman caught up to him. But the two police officers, they were able to run back to their car. They got in and they sped off towards the station, and they told people what was going on at this train. I mean, they couldn't even describe it really without it sounding totally made up. And so eventually, reinforcements head back to the train. And when they get there, they find the assistant. He clearly had been caught by this woman on his way to the car, and he was destroyed. His stomach was ripped wide open. He was dead. But, the authorities, they searched everywhere, and they couldn't find this woman. Her upper half was just gone. Her legs were still stuck in the tracks, but the murderous upper half of her was gone, and they never found her. Today, it's said that the animated top half of this woman's corpse still haunts the railroad tracks in Hokkaido. She's known as Tiki Tiki because that is the name that was given to sort of encapsulate the sound that she would make as she pulled herself through the snow. The sort of chik, chik sound became Tiki Tiki. Now, according to some versions of this story, after you've heard the legend of Tiki Tiki, like you have now, you only have 3 days before she shows up to get you. But it is possible to survive it. Before she slices you in half across your midsection, she'll pause to ask you one question. And if you answer this question correctly, she'll let you live. The question is, do you need your legs? And the only correct answer, spoken exactly like this, is yes, I need them right now. All right, thank you all so much for joining me tonight at the campfire. And if you enjoyed this, remember, we actually have a whole playlist of campfire episodes that are ready for you to binge right now. If you want to do that, go ahead and click right here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.
Around noon on October 21st, 1988, a man named Valentino sat at a cafe table sipping a coffee on a sidewalk in Buenos Aires, Argentina. So this particular neighborhood was called Caballito, and it was right in the heart of Buenos Aires. It was very densely populated, and there were lots of tall apartment buildings and shops and cafes with tons of pedestrians and tons of traffic. And so as a result, it often felt very loud and chaotic, and today was no different. But Valentino, despite the craziness all around him, he still wanted to try to find a moment of peace as he had his coffee. And so he sort of sat back in his chair and he just looked up at the sky above all the urban noise, and he took this deep, calming breath. And as he did this, he saw a few birds fly by, and he just kind of smiled to himself, watching them fly on. But then he saw something else. Out of the corner of his eye, just across the street, he saw a flash of something brown plummeting towards the ground in front of a tall apartment building. And so Valentino turned his attention to look and see what this thing was. But what he saw didn't make any sense. There was this one old woman on the other side of the street who had stopped on the sidewalk, and she was staring down at what appeared to be like a pile of clothes at her feet. And the brown thing, the thing that caught Valentino's attention, which he couldn't make out what it was just a few feet away from this pile in front of this woman. But then, this old woman across the street, she just began screaming. And that's when Valentino realized that what he thought was like a pile of clothes at her feet was actually like a person, like a heap of a person on the ground. It was another old woman, and she was completely motionless on the ground. And so Valentino, he's shocked by what he's seeing. He's trying to make sense of it, and he's seeing again now, knowing it's a person on the ground and seeing this brown thing over here, and he's thinking, was that flash of brown, like that brown thing falling and striking this woman who's now motionless on the ground? Is that what happened? And as Valentino is sort of coming up with theories about what he's even looking at, it seemed like at the same time, the entire bustling neighborhood all around him also, just for a moment, stopped and just sort of paid attention to whatever madness was happening over there, as they too were trying to piece together what happened. But then, that brief moment of almost relative calm just completely dissipated, and the street once again descended into total chaos. Passerby and locals started shouting and racing over to the woman on the ground to help her, and very quickly this woman and the other woman who was screaming was completely surrounded by this huge crowd. And Valentino, for his part, he felt very shaken by what he was seeing, and just thinking about the fact that he might have seen effectively this woman get destroyed by whatever this brown thing was. He did see that flash of brown, and so he's sort of traumatized, and he's also, he's thinking he doesn't want to contribute to the pandemonium over there by running over to join the massive throng of people trying to figure out what happened. And so instead, he just stayed at his cafe table, with his coffee, and just watched as this crowd continued to build across the road. Finally, Valentino heard sirens, and he knew that meant an ambulance had to be close. But for some reason, even though he knew that was objectively a good thing, help was on the way, maybe they can save this woman on the ground, he doesn't know. Even though he felt like he should feel relieved now that professionals are going to show up, they're going to clear the crowd, they're going to handle this, he just couldn't calm down. He literally couldn't stop. His heart was racing, his pulse was racing, his stomach was in knots. He felt terrible. It was like he was completely reliving this trauma that he's just experienced over and over and over again. As soon as the ambulance came into view and parked, the mass of people saw them and right away parted to let the paramedics come through to try to help this woman. And Valentino, from across the road, he was craning his neck to try and see, what was happening. And as he did, he saw this middle-aged woman who he didn't know crossing the street in the direction of this scene over there. And she just looked like she was just curious. And as she's crossing the road, she got destroyed by a city bus. It plowed directly into her, and she immediately disappeared underneath the bus's wheels. And so Valentino, whose heart was already basically beating out of his chest, he was so upset about everything, he shot to his feet like, what is going on here? Screams erupted from all around him, from other people who had seen the same horrible thing. And he could feel his heart just racing nonstop, and sweat began dripping down his back. He was almost dizzy with shock, and he began to stagger away from his table, looking frantically around, calling out for somebody to actually help him. It was like his body couldn't handle what he was seeing. But nobody came because there were so many other things happening, horrible things that demanded immediate attention from other people that no one's paying attention to Valentino having, a panic attack here. He's so low on the object that fell from the sky, the flash of brown. She died from the impact. And then that woman, the middle-aged woman who crossed the road to see what was going on, who got hit by the bus, she also died. And Valentino, turned out that brownish object was actually the fourth victim in this tragedy. That object was actually a poodle named Khaki that had chased a ball straight off the balcony of its owner's 13th floor apartment. This is a paid ad by BetterHelp. It's normal to long for a time when, connection felt easy and being close to people didn't take so much effort. And then you take a look at your life now and it just feels different, busier and more complicated. There are moments I think about sometimes, nothing big, just, sitting with people I cared about, talking about nothing. At the time, those moments themselves didn't feel important. But now, looking back, I think I'd tell that version of myself to cherish those moments as they were occurring because they don't last forever. And so someday, the relationships you have today may be the ones you wish you had held on to a little bit tighter. Therapy may be able to help you work through life's changes and provide the tools to navigate what's next, even if it looks different than it used to. BetterHelp makes starting therapy easier. Take the quiz and get matched with a credentialed therapist quickly. Switch anytime at no extra cost if it's not the right fit. BetterHelp has served over 6 million people globally. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen and get 10% off your first month of therapy. At 3 a.m. on Sunday, December 24th, 1967, 26-year-old Sammy Brown Jr. sped in his car down a road called Seal Road in Phoenix City, Alabama, with a police siren blaring right behind him. So Sammy was in trouble. It was Christmas Eve, and he had celebrated a little too hard and drank way too much, and he thought he'd be okay to drive home since he lived close by, but he'd been wrong, and he'd ultimately attracted the attention of a police officer who was now chasing him. And Sammy knew he could not get caught, because in addition to being very drunk, he also didn't even have a license to drive in the first place. And so that's why right now he was driving at 100 miles an hour to get away from this cop. But not only was the cop actually gaining on him, but also Sammy could see on the road up ahead that he had another problem, because there was another car in front of him driving in the same direction, and because this other car was actually going the speed limit, Sammy was going to smash into them if he didn't swerve around them. But this was not a highway where Sammy could just easily change lanes. It was a local 2-lane road. So Sammy knew that if he wanted to swerve around this car, he would have to swerve into the oncoming traffic lane. But since Sammy kind of looked and didn't see any other cars in that lane, he just decided to go for it and pray that he got lucky. So Sammy cut his wheel and tried to swerve around this slower car. But again, Sammy is extremely drunk. He's being chased by this cop who's gaining on him, so his anxiety is spiking. He's going so fast, and in this state of mind, Sammy actually misjudged the timing of his swerve, and he clipped the back of the slower car. And as soon as he did, there was this crunch of metal, and both cars began to spin out across the road before they sort of miraculously just came to a stop. Inside of his own car, Sammy sort of sat up and looked around and realized he was unhurt. And then when he looked out the window, he could see the driver of the other car, a man in his 60s, slowly get out and walk to his bumper to inspect the damage. And when Sammy saw this, he realized that despite how bad of a situation he was in, he actually had gotten very lucky. I mean, not only was he alive, but the man he had just hit going nearly 100 miles an hour also appeared to not just be alive, but basically seemed okay. Following the crash, Sammy expected to have some pretty harsh consequences, and he was charged for reckless driving and also driving without a license. But, sort of amazingly, his lucky streak actually would continue, because despite the charges, he didn't actually have to serve any jail time. He just had to pay a couple of fines, which meant Sammy really did not learn his lesson. And so, over a year later, on April 13th, 1969, Sammy once again spent all of his Saturday night drinking, and then at about 1:30 a.m. on Sunday morning, he got into that same car, which he still did not have a license to drive, and then he once again sped down Seal Road, the same road he got arrested on last December. And, wouldn't you know it, just like the last time, he saw a car ahead of him in his lane going too slow, and he decided to go around it. This time, however, he was not being chased by police, so he was not nearly as frantic or anxious. So he began shifting lanes much further away from this slower car. And when he moved into the opposing traffic lane, because of the distance he had given himself, he didn't clip the car in front of him. And for a split second, he felt an intense rush of satisfaction, because this was just more proof to Sammy that he was just an incredibly lucky guy. However, before Sammy could drive his car back into the correct lane, he went around a curve in the road and was immediately blinded by a searing bright light. Then there was a deafening bang, and Sammy's car jerked to the side, and all he saw was a violent swirl of motion as his car again spun around and then finally came to a stop. For a few moments, Sammy just sat there, feeling completely stunned. I mean, again, he's gotten into a high-speed wreck, and he's sort of taking stock of, did he even survive? But after a few moments, he realized he definitely had lived. His neck ached quite a bit from being shaken so hard, but other than that, he kind of looked around and he realized, once again, he was basically unhurt, so he had just gotten really lucky again. And so eventually, he climbed out of his car, and even though he was sort of dizzy from the crash, from the alcohol, when he took stock of what was in front of him, he could immediately see what had just happened. In his effort to avoid hitting the car that was driving in the same lane as him, he had swerved into oncoming traffic and hit a different car, another car, head on, that was driving in the opposite direction. This was like a worst case scenario. and both his car and the one he had hit were completely destroyed with the fronts completely smashed in. It was truly a miracle Sammy had walked out of that car. And so Sammy, he staggered over to look at the other car and see if the other driver and, potential passengers were okay. When he staggered over there, when he looked inside of the wreckage, he could not believe what he saw. Because what he saw inside was yet another miraculous stroke of luck. Only this time, it was not the good kind. Sammy had somehow managed to do something that really should have been impossible. He had almost perfectly recreated the accident that he had had a year earlier. He was driving the same car, going down the same road on the same day of the week, and he had crashed for basically the exact same reasons. And then when Sammy looked inside of the car he hit head on, he realized there was one more truly just incredible coincidence. The driver of this car was the same driver as the car he hit a year earlier. The man's name was Francis Patterson. He was 65 years old, and he didn't even live in Phoenix City where this crash happened. It was just a wild coincidence that 2 times, more than a year apart, Sammy had hit him while driving drunk on Seal Road. The only difference this second time around was Francis died from the crash. Following this tragedy, Sammy Brown Jr. was charged with driving while intoxicated and also involuntary manslaughter. He was sentenced to 12 months in prison. On a Sunday night in early 1805, a 13-year-old boy named Emile Deschamps sat at a table full of adults in a house in Orléans, France. Now, Emile was supposed to be having dinner with all the other boys at his boarding school across the city, but his aunt had picked him up as a surprise for a home-cooked meal. And he knew why. His aunt was worried about him. So Emile's parents had sent him to this boarding school in Orléans a few years ago, but he hated the city, and basically right after he got there, his mother had died. And so Emile had really had a difficult time adjusting, and he felt lonely and isolated, and his aunt was definitely aware of that. And so tonight, Emile was very grateful that his aunt, because, she kind of felt bad for him, had brought him here to include him in this dinner, like he appreciated that. But this particular dinner was just full of adults that he didn't know, and it was just incredibly boring. In fact, right now, one of his aunt's middle-aged friends, this guy whose name was Monsieur Fonceboeuf, was just rambling on and on about his experience in the military, and, Emile was just not remotely interested. I mean, this was not exciting to him in the least, and so he did what he always did. He just sort of tuned this guy out and let his mind wander. Because Emile had this really big imagination, and he would routinely, especially when he was, lonely and sad at school, he would just kind of disappear into his own thoughts. But quickly, after he sort of began letting his mind wander, he was pulled right back to reality when his aunt set the dessert down right in the middle of the table. So this dessert was a brown, sauce-drenched cake-like thing that was actually wrapped in a cloth and was piping hot, literally steam coming off of it. And Emile, he just kind of stared at it because he had never seen a dessert like this before and had no idea what it was. And so as he was staring at it, he heard a voice at the table say, "Oh, it was plum pudding, and Emile, you should try this." Emile looked over at the voice who had said this, and it belonged to Monsieur de Fontainebleau, who was smiling at him. This is the guy who had been rambling about his military experience. And the Monsieur repeated that Emile really needed to try a slice of this plum pudding, because it was an amazing traditional English dessert, and it was just absolutely delicious. So Emile let his aunt cut him a slice, and then he took a bite. And he was glad he did, because it really was incredible. It was this rich and sweet and just perfectly warm dessert. I mean, this was like one of the best desserts he had ever had. And so after trying this plum pudding and, telling the monsieur how great it was and thanking his aunt, he just kind of went back to letting his mind wander, and the conversation at the table picked back up again, and, it was just boring adult talk, and the night just kind of continued as is. And then at some point in the night, when the meal and the dessert and everything had all been eaten up, the guests parted ways, and Emile went back to his boarding school. And quickly, when he got back to his boarding school, he forgot about the dinner and the pudding and the monsieur, and just carried on with his life. One afternoon, 10 years later, in the spring of 1815, Emile was 23 years old, and he was living in Paris, about 80 miles away from Orléans. So Emile had basically fled Orléans as soon as he was old enough to strike out on his own. And once he had turned his big imagination into a blossoming career. He was now a poet and a playwright, and he was writing about these big, sweeping human experiences like love and chaos and how mysterious life can be. So Emile that day had basically been writing nonstop and had sort of lost track of time and sort of forgot to eat. And then suddenly he felt super hungry. And so now here he was out and about looking for something to eat. But he was so hungry that he decided he didn't even care where he went. I mean, normally he was picky about where he would eat lunch and dinner, but today he just wanted food. He didn't care where it was. And so he just randomly chose a cafe and went inside. It was a small space with a few customers sitting at some tables, and Emile just walked in and took a seat at an empty one. And quickly thereafter, a waitress came over and handed Emile a menu, and when he flipped it open, he was immediately drawn to the dessert section. He saw this cafe served plum pudding, the amazing English dessert that he had had a decade earlier at that dinner party with his aunt and the monsieur. He had not had plum pudding from that day to now. It had been 10 years. He had just not had it, but he saw it on the menu and he's like, oh my goodness, I gotta have plum pudding again. That was so good 10 years ago. I gotta have that experience again. And so Emile asked this waitress if he can have a slice of their plum pudding. And she just shook her head and said, I'm sorry, but the last piece we had, I actually just served it to the guy over there. Like, we don't have any more. And the waitress, she saw Emile react to this and he was like so distraught. He's like, oh man, really? Like, there's no more? Are you serious? And the waitress could sense like he really, really wanted this plum pudding. And so she goes, well, hold on a minute. And she turns and she calls out to the gentleman that she had actually just given the last piece to, who was sitting in the corner of the cafe. And she calls to him and says, hey, would you mind sharing that last piece with this new guest here, with Emile? Because he wants a piece of this plum pudding. And so Emile, he kind of looks around the waitress in the direction of the person that she's speaking to, the guy with the actual plum pudding. And the guy who's sitting over there, he looks up, and wouldn't you know it, it's Monsieur de Fontainebleau, the same guy who was at the dinner party 10 years earlier, who encouraged Emile to eat plum pudding for the first time and only time in his whole life at that point. It's the same guy. Like, they're not even in Orléans, France. They're 80 miles away in Paris. And Emile, he's chosen a random cafe. He'd never been here before, and he just happened to see plum pudding on the menu. Like, what are the odds that it's the same guy and they're having plum pudding? Like, the coincidence here is just unbelievable. And so Emile, he sort of says to the waitress, hold on a minute, I know him. And so Emile, he gets up and walks over to the monsieur, and he sits down next to him, and they're both like, Emile sat at a tea party in Paris, having a great time as he chatted with the other guests at his table. He'd been invited to this party by the hostess, who was a big admirer of his work. And there were actually a lot of people like that these days. Emile was now in his 60s. Right away, he knew he had to have some. It was plum pudding. And so as the staff person came over with the plum pudding to give to Emile, he sort of laughed and told, the staff person and the people at his table the story of how, over the course of his life, he'd only had plum pudding 2 times, when he was 13 and when he was 23. And in both of those situations, when he had had plum pudding, this guy, Monsieur de Fontainebleau, had been present. This man that he didn't know and had only interacted with when he was eating plum pudding. And it was kind of like this crazy coincidence. He described seeing him 10 years later in Paris. He couldn't believe it. That was 38 years ago, but still, it's like this wild coincidence, the biggest one of his whole life. And so he sort of jokingly told the people at the table and the staff, like, hey, here I am about to eat for the 3rd time plum pudding. We better be on the lookout for the monsieur. He's bound to show up. And everyone kind of laughed. They're like, yeah, that's crazy. And so Emile, he gets his plate of plum pudding, he gets his fork, and he scoops a bite, and he's about to eat it when the butler walks into the room and announces that there is going to be one more guest joining them at this tea party. And who walks in, this additional guest? None other than Monsieur de Fontainebleau. And so Emile, he's about to bite the plum pudding, and he looks up
and he sees him and he can't believe it. I mean, the guy is like 1,000 years old and he hasn't seen him for 38 years. And the only other times are when he's eating plum pudding. And wouldn't you know it, for the third time here, it's happening again. Like, this is unbelievable. It was crazy the second time. This is now impossible. How is it that he's here as I'm about to eat for the third time this plum pudding? It doesn't make sense. And so Emile just stared at the monsieur with this look of just absolute shock on his face. And the monsieur, as he walked in, he sort of stopped and scanned the room, and he eventually met eyes with Emile. And he had this look of just total confusion on his face. He's looking at Emile, he's seeing the plum pudding that he's eating, kind of, scoping out the whole room. And then the monsieur, he just turned around and he walked away. It would turn out Monsieur de Fontaibu had been invited to another party on the same floor and had mistakenly wandered into Emile's party at the exact moment he was being served plum pudding for the third time in his entire life. This was truly just an astounding set of coincidences over, a 50-year period. Like, the odds of this all happening exactly as it did those 3 different times he had plum pudding and there was the monsieur, for things to line up that way, it was just staggering to imagine how perfectly each coincidence had to line up. It was almost so much that Emile felt like, there's got to be something else going on here. This can't just be coincidence. It was just like too much. And so, in fact, Emile would go on to recount his plum pudding and the monsieur story many, many times to his friends in literary circles, and he would ultimately write about it in his eventual memoir. Today, it's been around 200 years since the plum pudding events took place. And during that time, Emile's account has been dissected countless times by probability experts and scientists and mathematicians from all around the world. And nobody has a good answer for how this could have happened. And so in the end, Emile's account about what happened to him actually ended up becoming the foundation for a very famous philosophical concept pioneered by Carl Jung called synchronicity. Synchronicity basically means that some coincidences might not actually be coincidences. They might not be random at all, but instead are actually connected to a much larger meaning or purpose, even if we don't know what that is. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. On the night of September 11th, 1899, a 23-year-old student named Alice Knott sat in her bedroom in the Washington, D.C. boarding house where she lived, doing what she did every single night, which was to study. So Alice rarely left her room. She'd spent the last few months preparing to take this really important civil service exam, which she had to pass if she wanted to land the stable government job that she desperately wanted. But studying was not the only reason that Alice seemingly never went out. Alice was also sort of naturally a recluse, in part because she had a lot of health issues, like a weak heart and poor circulation, and she just generally got sick a lot. So being out in the world was really tiring for her and also sort of scary. And it was just easier and safer to stay inside. Now, it was getting late in the night, and there was some cold air coming in through her open bedroom window, and it was actually unusually cold outside tonight. And since she got sick pretty easily, she didn't want to risk this draft coming in, giving her a cold or something. So she set her work down for a moment, and she went up to close the window. And then on her way back to her desk, she smiled at the other very important reason that she spent so much time in her room: her beloved pet parrot, Polly. And Polly was sitting on his typical perch, one of the room's light fixtures, and as he saw Alice approaching, he got really excited and began squawking really loudly. Now, Alice knew that basically any minute now, she was very likely going to hear a loud knock at her door about the loud noise, because most of the people who lived in this boarding house with her hated Polly. And Polly, admittedly, was kind of a mean bird. Not only was he really loud, but he bit people and made really threatening noises and had some bad disruptive habits that pretty much drove everybody who lived in the building crazy.
Like right now, Polly, in addition to squawking really loudly, was also pecking the metal frame of the light fixture that it was on, which not only made additional noise, but it also damaged the light fixture. Which, to most people in the building, they didn't care so much about the light fixture, but the landlord did. And so it was just this general consensus that Polly is sort of nasty and loud and also damages stuff. So nobody liked Polly, and they really told Alice that she needed to get rid of Polly, and soon, because he is a real problem. But Alice would not get rid of Polly. She loved Polly, and Polly loved Alice. He wasn't mean to Alice. He followed her around everywhere and was very sweet to her. And so Alice she felt very attached to this bird. In fact, in many ways, she viewed Polly as being sort of like her only family. The only reason she was in this boarding house to begin with is because her brother and both her parents had passed away. And so a lot of time, it was just Alice and Polly in this room together. And so it was just a very important relationship. It was like the only relationship that Alice really had. And so Alice just walked over to Polly, who was still squawking loudly and pecking at this light fixture, and she just told him to stop what he was doing. And he listened. He went completely quiet, and, she pet him for a second, and then a moment later, she was back at her desk, back to studying, and for the next few hours, that's what she did, until her eyes got too tired to stay open, and she went to bed. Hours later, in the middle of the night, Alice suddenly stirred awake, and she sat up in her bed. And she had no idea what caused her to wake up. But what she did know is something just felt wrong. Her chest felt incredibly tight, and she actually felt kind of dizzy. And so she got out of bed, and she stumbled her way over to the door to get help. But she didn't get there. After taking only a few steps, her legs suddenly gave out from under her, and she fell to the ground. The next day, just before 1 p.m., the landlord of the boarding house bustled around the kitchen, putting some lunch on the table. And then when he was done and all the food was laid out for his guests, he called out to the house to let everybody know that lunch was ready and to come on down. And a few moments later, all the guests appeared at the table, except for Alice. Now, the landlord immediately noticed this, and it did bother them. I mean, they hadn't seen Alice all morning. However, they did know that Alice typically stayed up late studying, so it wasn't all that unusual for her to sleep in. But even by her standards, 1 p.m. was very late, and so the landlord decided they would just go up to her room and make sure she was okay. And so the landlord went down the hallway to the last door, which was Alice's, and they knocked, but there was no answer. So after trying a few more times and still not getting an answer, they just reached down, turned the knob, it was unlocked, and they opened the door. And immediately, as soon as that door opened, the landlord began to gag. So there were a lot of things about Alice's pet parrot Polly that really concerned people. And Alice, who loved her bird and considered it the only thing saving her from total awful loneliness, sort of looked the other way when it came to all those concerns. However, there was one thing that Alice should not have ignored, and that was her parrot's drug problem. So in 1899, interior lighting inside of homes was almost exclusively open flames, and those flames were powered by gas. And it would turn out Polly regularly liked to inhale that gas. He would basically get high. When he was pecking at the light fixture, he wasn't doing it just to make noise or to damage it. He was doing it to turn the valve in order to suck on this gas until he basically passed out. Now, Alice did know Polly did this, but she would typically stop him while he was in the process of trying to get high and just kind of keep him from doing it. Or if after he had turned the valve and passed out, she would just move her parrot and then close the valve. Or she would keep her window open to ensure that the gas wouldn't get trapped in her room. But on this night, it was so cold outside, she shut the window, and then she fell asleep because she was so exhausted from all the studying, and it was after she had fallen asleep that Polly pecked the valve open, got high on the gas, passed out, and then the room continued to fill with this poisonous gas. So when the landlord opened up the door, the reason they gagged is they were hit by this surge of gas that had been trapped inside the room for hours. And then when they looked inside, they saw Alice's body lying on the ground by the bed, not moving, and then at the landlord's feet, flattened on the ground with their beak wedged under the crack at the bottom of the door, was the parrot. Alice would die from inhaling the gas, but the parrot survived because he was able to make his way over to the door and breathe in that fresh air. And so the parrot recovered and would continue to huff gas whenever it got the chance. When you're refreshing your space, choosing a paint color can feel weirdly high stakes. Will that seafoam green that you loved online look more like split pea soup on your walls? Luckily, Sherwin-Williams takes the guesswork out of finding the perfect paint color. With 3 easy ways to sample, you can choose color with confidence, testing shades in your actual space before making the final call. Order color chips, peel and stick, or color-to-go paint samples at swsamples.com or visit your neighborhood Sherwin-Williams store to get started today. Late one night in September of 1993, 43-year-old Linda Gowdy suddenly startled awake inside of her bed in her home in Stoneham, Massachusetts. She had just had this really horrible nightmare about how she was going to die. So in a few weeks, Linda and her boyfriend, whose name was Tim, were planning to go on a Caribbean cruise. And in Linda's dream that she just had, she had been on that vacation, and during that trip, she had basically seen herself dying in a car. And this dream, I mean, it was no ordinary dream. It had been so vivid, so awful, that even now, she knew she was awake, but her heart was still racing. She was still dripping sweat. It was like she couldn't fully escape from this nightmare. And as she's just kind of sitting there with these horrible thoughts in her mind, she began to realize that this was no ordinary dream. This was a premonition. So Linda was a doctor. She was an obstetrician and gynecologist who worked at a hospital in Stoneham, Massachusetts. And by all accounts, she was excellent at her job. Not just because she was smart and experienced, but also because she was just naturally intuitive and had this sort of like sixth sense when it came to her work. In a lot of cases, trusting her gut and going off of her intuition had actually saved the lives of her patients and their babies. And so she had sort of developed a reputation for being this way, and it had led to many patients actually traveling to her from all over the region to have their babies or just to see her in general, because it just sort of seemed like she was the person who could handle any problem, mostly because she would get ahead of it and sort of predict complications and treat them before they became complications. But this sixth sense that she had did not just pertain to work. She also would have, these sort of gut feelings or premonitions, like the dream she had just had, about her personal life. And almost always, her intuition on these things or her visions of the future would pan out to be right. So Linda knew that in order to literally protect herself, she needed to cancel her trip to the Caribbean. And even though she knew this was the right call, it didn't stop it from being hugely disappointing. She'd planned this whole trip, she'd been really looking forward to it, as was her boyfriend Tim, and also she sort of felt like this was an important trip for her relationship with Tim. She had been with Tim now for 4 years, and he too was a doctor, and they spent all their time together at the hospital. They both worked at the same hospital, but lately they'd been struggling and fighting a little bit more. Tim had sort of become pretty overprotective of her, like he was becoming sort of like controlling. And so it was just sort of exhausting dealing with their relationship issues. And this trip to the Caribbean, she saw as like this easy way to like get out of their normal shock of waking up to this horrible nightmare. And she laid back down and she just told herself that she would figure it out in the morning. Like this was obviously bad, but at least she wasn't gonna die in a car crash in the Caribbean. A few weeks later, and now just a few minutes ago, they had actually run into each other in the hospital hallway because they both worked there together. And they had gotten into this huge fight about the cancellation of this trip, and other coworkers had actually overheard it. And so now Linda was not only mad, but also embarrassed, that other people saw her fighting. And so as soon as she got into her office, she just slammed the door behind her and sat down and tried to focus on her work, reviewing patient charts and other things like that, but she just couldn't. Now, Linda knew that canceling this trip was the right thing to do. She was sure that if she had gone to the Caribbean, she and maybe even Tim would have died in a car. Like she knew that she was preventing that. But at the same time, she also just hated how this premonition was now further complicating her relationship. And so now Linda just told herself to calm down. She took a few deep breaths and told herself, you have other things that are coming up that will help distract her from the drama of her relationship and this trip. Like she had a massage she had booked for herself on her day off tomorrow, and she also had her college reunion this weekend. Two things she was definitely looking forward to that so far anyways, she had not had a premonition about, so she had not canceled. Finally, around 8:15 p.m., when Linda's shift finally came to an end and she had left the hospital to make her way home, she actually was in pretty good spirits. Even though she had certainly not resolved things with Tim, they were still very much fighting. This Caribbean trip really had become a pain in both of their sides. Despite all that, Linda was determined that, she's not going to let this be just a constant drag on her life. She needs to just live her life and just go forward, and in time, things will sort themselves out. 4 days later, on the afternoon of Monday, October 4th, one of Linda's friends was driving towards the hospital where Linda worked. And this friend was very worried about Linda, since she hadn't heard from Linda since they spoke on the phone last Thursday, which in and of itself was not a particularly big deal since they didn't speak every day. But this friend had also spoken to one of Linda's coworkers that morning who was also worried about Linda, because Linda apparently didn't show up for work that morning, and the staff at the hospital were very worried, and they had even sent someone to Linda's house to check on her to make sure she was okay, but she wasn't home. And Linda, she rarely missed work, and if she did, she called in. And so to find out that she hadn't called in and nobody knew where she was, combined with the fact that this friend has not heard from her, like the friend is thinking something's wrong here. And so they were going to the hospital to basically get together with their coworkers to just get to the bottom of this, to figure out what happened to Linda. But now, as the friend turned into the hospital's parking lot, she could immediately see that something was terribly wrong here, because the lot was crawling with police officers. They'd completely roped off the whole area, and then there was this one big group of people sort of standing over at the perimeter. And so when the friend pulled up and parked their car, she got out and she rushed over to this group to see what they were all looking at. And when she saw, she just gasped. It would turn out Linda's premonition was eerily accurate, but Linda had misinterpreted it. So on the previous Thursday, when she had left work after that long shift and she's looking forward to her massage the next day and the college reunion that weekend, she's trying not to think about the toxicity with her boyfriend Tim. She heads out, to head back home and just be done for the weekend, but she never makes it home. In fact, she never leaves the hospital grounds, because shortly after leaving the hospital, Linda was attacked and strangled to death inside of her car. Linda had been convinced that the death in the car was going to take place in the Caribbean, and so avoid the Caribbean. What she didn't realize is that it had nothing to do with the Caribbean. It was simply that she was going to die in a car, and she did. Meaning the premonition she had was right. She did die in a car. The location was just wrong. So Linda's boyfriend, Tim Stryker, was the only suspect in her murder. He had no alibi, and he still went on that cruise to the Caribbean without Linda, right after her body was found. And he was later caught paying a witness to give the police false information about seeing Linda with another man at the time of her death. However, Tim was never officially charged with Linda's murder and denied all involvement. However, he was convicted of perjury and was sentenced to 4 years in prison, where he would die in 2011. On a spring evening in 1705, a middle-aged man named John McCall sat by his wife's bedside in Lurgan, Ireland, crying so hard he could barely catch his breath. His wife, Marjorie, had unfortunately just passed away minutes ago from what appeared to be a horrible fever. So John was actually a doctor, and a few days ago, when his wife came down with this fever, even though John had not been able to actually diagnose what was causing her fever, what he did know is that the fever was just ravaging her body and it was going to kill her. And so over the next couple of days, John just had to watch in horror as his wife basically just shut down. And now, in some ways, her death was like a mercy, but it was still devastating for John, in part because he felt so helpless. Like, he's a doctor and he couldn't save his wife. But now, despite how unfair this whole thing seemed, John had to kind of pick up the pieces. I mean, his wife in many ways was like his whole world. They had kids, they had grandkids, they were only in their 50s, but much of those 50 years have been spent together. And so now it's like he was this lost soul. And so he just looked down at his wife and he just reached out and he grabbed her hand, the hand that he was so familiar with, and he squeezed it. And it was just limp. And it made it even more upsetting that like she was really gone. And then he looked at her actual hand and he saw the beautiful gold wedding ring that he had saved all this money for, that they both had loved so much. Just seeing that ring on her finger, on that limp hand of hers, it really reinforced the finality of this moment. He couldn't believe this had happened, but it was real. His wife really was gone. And so now, as John continued to cry and squeeze his wife's hand and just sort of reflect on this horrible situation, he also, in tandem, knew that he had to start thinking about her funeral. He would have to plan it really quickly so they could bury her really quickly. So at this time in Ireland, it was traditional to hold a multi-day wake when somebody died so that friends and relatives could have time to pay their respects before the actual burial took place. But if somebody died from disease, like obviously John's wife had, something had caused the fever, he didn't know what, but it had to be some sort of disease. If that was the case, the wake was off the table, and the person was buried pretty much right away just to prevent the sickness from spreading further. But even though John knew this, he couldn't quite bring himself to face that reality, the idea that his wife would be in the ground as soon as like tomorrow. But for right this second, John did not get up and, start making arrangements here. He just wanted to soak up the last few moments he had with his wife before she was in the ground. The following day, John stood beside his wife's casket as it was lowered into the ground at their local cemetery in front of a crowd of other mourners. Even though Marjorie, because of the disease factor, had not had a wake, John had still expected to spend this day focused primarily on grieving and thinking about all the things he loved about his wife. But instead, he found himself on this particular day very fixated on something else: his wife's wedding ring. So John really wanted his wife's wedding ring, just to have something to remind him of Marjorie, and he loved that ring. It was something that meant a lot to him. But pretty much right after Marjorie had died, as part of the decomposition process, her fingers had begun to swell really badly, and he could not remove the ring from his wife's finger. Nobody could. Other people tried, they couldn't do it. And so ultimately, the decision was made to just bury her with the ring. And so, of course, that in and of itself was sad for John. He really wanted that ring. But also, as John stood there watching her casket get lowered into the ground with this ring inside, he was worried that now her gravesite could potentially become a target for grave robbers. Now, grave robbing has been a thing as long as there have been graves, but it was especially common in Ireland in the early 1700s when the story took place, because the country at the time was experiencing widespread famine and poverty, and people were desperate. And so things like gold wedding rings inside of graves became things worth taking. And so John just felt like, am I always going to be worried that my wife's final resting place is going to at some point be disturbed? But, by the time Marjorie was actually buried that day and people had sort of moved on, as much as John really wished that ring wasn't in there, that he had it, there was nothing he could do. And so he decided he would just try to honor his wife's memory in other ways. That night, John was back in his home in front of the fire with his kids and his relatives all around him. And they were all crying and laughing and sharing their favorite memories of Marjorie. And then every time someone told a story about Marjorie, they would all lift their drinks and they would toast to her. Now, for John, this was very cathartic. This definitely was helping him grieve. But John was also just exhausted from his grief, and also the whirlwind of the last few days and just how wretched they had been. And so even though people definitely were intending to stay up for quite a while here, John, at some point in a lull in all the stories and laughter and crying, he stood up to head off to bed. But as soon as he did, as he began leaving the crowd and they're all kind of watching him, he heard a knock at the door. And so John sighed and headed towards the door, assuming it had to be, one or more mourners who want to come in and pay their respects and just sort of be there for him. But when he opened the door, it was not a mourner. It was something else entirely. And when he saw what was out there, It made his breath catch in his chest, and then suddenly he felt this shooting pain rocketing through his chest. Then he felt his legs buckle underneath him, and before he knew it, he was falling to the ground. It would turn out John had been right to be worried about the fact that his wife was buried with her wedding ring. Because not long after she was laid to rest, word had gotten out that there was this ring inside of her grave, and grave robbers, they dug her up. But just like John and everybody else who tried, the grave robbers also could not get the ring to come off of Marjorie's swollen finger. So they had to cut off her finger to get the ring. But when they did that, a very unexpected thing happened. Marjorie sat up and started screaming. So even though John was a doctor, he had been wrong when he thought she had died. I mean, he wasn't the only one. Lots of people thought she had died. However, nobody caught it, and they were so quick to bury her because they were fearful of whatever had caused her fever, that disease, that it would continue to spread, that they buried her while she was alive. Just nobody knew. And then those grave robbers, when they cut off her finger, well, the pain of having her finger lopped off basically jolted her out of this catatonic state she was in, and she sat up and she was fully alive again. But when Marjorie basically stumbled from the cemetery, fresh from her grave, back to her home to tell her husband that, hey, I'm still here, when John opened the door and he saw his wife standing there covered in dirt and missing a finger and looking horrible, he was so shocked and so scared that he had a heart attack, and he actually died. John was buried in the same plot that Marjorie had just been dug out of. And Marjorie, despite what happened to her, she went on to live for many more years, just without her ring finger. And then when she finally did die, she was buried in the same cemetery and was given a headstone with the inscription, "Lived once, buried twice." That headstone is still at Shankill Cemetery in Ireland today. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. And remember, we have a whole playlist of Places You Can't Go episodes ready for you to binge right now. So go ahead and click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.